Hey everybody. So I want to talk about coaches a little bit, and particularly coaches that I think are either on the hot seat or their seat is starting to get a little bit warm here. And Cal- uh, Chicago and LA have already made coaching changes. They've fired their coaches and made their moves. Both of those are really struggling teams at this point. So, with those two moves made, I want to look at other coaches that I think could be potentially fired, and some that, if things continue the way that they go, they could end up surprisingly out of a job. So, let's start with guys who I think are seats are currently pretty hot. These are guys who need to win now, or they're going to find themselves out of a job. And right at the top of that list is Dave Haxtell in Philadelphia. Philadelphia is not off to a good start. They're 9-9-2, 500 team, out of a playoff spot right now. They're currently they've just been flat out disappointing this season. They've got goaltender injury problems. Their star players are not playing all that well. There's a lot of issues going on in Philadelphia, and their special teams are horrendous. Their goaltending's not good. Ivan Provorov looks like he's injured or has something wrong with him. Shane Gostisbehere hasn't been all that great. There's problems in Philly, and 500 is not acceptable for the Philadelphia Flyers. That lineup is too good. There's too much talent on that team for Philadelphia to be in the position that they are. They absolutely should be a top 3 team in the Metro Division, and right now they're not. There's been talk over the last couple years about Hackstall and how much, what his job security is like. If they continue like this, he is going to be fired before the end of the season. And if they go on a losing streak, he's gone because they're going to need to get someone else in there immediately and try and turn things around and at least salvage a playoff spot this year. So Hackstall, I think, is on very thin ice in Philadelphia. Another guy on extremely thin ice is Mike Yeo in St. Louis. St. Louis misses the playoffs last year, and when they should have been a playoff team. They were in a playoff spot for most of the year. They collapsed down the stretch. They should have been a playoff team. They weren't. I thought Mike Yeo was going to be gone after last season. St. Louis stuck with him. They made a lot of roster changes this offseason. They brought in a ton of new faces. They were supposed to be the winners of the offseason and a much improved team. They're 7-8-3 and one of the worst teams in the Western Conference right now. They've made the player changes and it hasn't worked. So what's next? The coaching change. Mike Yeo, I think, might be 2 losses away from being fired. He could be gone as early as the end of this week. I don't think they're... honestly, just to be nice, they probably won't fire him the week of Thanksgiving. But if they have a bad week this week, he will be gone at the beginning of next week. This is unacceptable. 7-8-3 and near the bottom of the Western Conference is unacceptable for a team with the roster that St. Louis has. They should be a playoff team. And they're not right now, and they've made the player changes. They have already made the moves with the roster, and it hasn't changed much. It's actually made them worse. They are under 500 right now. So next up is the coaching change. Either that or the GM gets canned, and the GM's going to fire the coach then, to save his job. So Yo, I think, is going to quickly find himself out of a job in St. Louis unless they start winning some games. St. Louis has a huge week this week. They play Nashville twice and Winnipeg once. Their next 3 games, Nashville, Winnipeg. If they can win those games, then they can get right back into it in the Central Division, and they can possibly save Mike Yeo's job. If they go 0-3 in those 3 games, Yeo is going to be gone at the beginning of next week. I'm calling that now. Yeo will be gone at the beginning of next week if they lose their next 3 games. If they end up 7-11-3 or 7-10-4, something like that, Yeo will be gone. And he should be, because they've made the player changes. Now it's time for the coach. What's happening in St. Louis this year is unacceptable. Now we're going to get into guys who I think have a little bit longer of a leash. Hackstol and Yo, I think, are on very thin ice. The rest of these guys, I think, have a much longer leash. A move may not be imminent, but a move is definitely possible if things go bad. Bob Boughner in Florida. So Boughner took over the team last year. They had a really rough start, but they had an excellent second half. Almost made the playoffs. They were this close to making the playoffs with a huge second half of the season. So everyone was like, okay, this team's headed in the right direction. We're looking good. This is not too bad. Going into this year, Florida was fully expected to be a playoff team. They were supposed to build off their success at the end of last year. They were supposed to be a playoff team. Everyone expected them to be a good team. They're off to a 7-7-3 start, and I think the patience is starting to run out. They just, something seems off, and they're losing games that they should win, and last night's game against New York is a prime example. The Florida Panthers have more talent than the New York Rangers right now. The Florida Panthers are a better team, should be a better team than the New York Rangers right now, but they lose that game 4-2 to drop back to 500. That's just a game you cannot lose, and they lost it. They're having a really mediocre start to the year, and I don't think they can afford that because they can't try and have an incredible second half again like they did last year and set themselves up to where they're playing catch-up all season long. It's just too hard to catch up in the NHL. They couldn't do it last year to get into a playoff spot. They probably won't be able to have the same level of success in the second half this season. Doing that 2 years in a row would be extremely difficult. So they have got to start winning games, or I think a change could be made there, and Boughner could get canned for someone else if they don't turn things around. They have got to be better than 500. Now a real interesting guy here, because even a month ago, you never ever would have thought this. Mike Sullivan in Pittsburgh, I think, might be wearing a little bit thin because Pittsburgh is off to a terrible start. 7-8-3, last place in the Eastern Conference. That is just completely un-Pittsburgh-like and completely unacceptable if you're the Penguins. They're way too good to be in last place. But the team is just not performing this year, and I think Sullivan has some leash here. He's not going to be gone tomorrow. But Pittsburgh has been very quick in the past to give up, to change coaches. Dan Bylsma, brought that team a lot of success in a Stanley Cup. And as soon as things went a little bit sour, he was gone. Bylsma was out in Pittsburgh. They could do the same thing with Sullivan. Sullivan has brought them 2 Stanley Cups 2 years in a row, but they got ousted by Washington last year. They're off to a terrible start this year. Sullivan, if this continues, if we get towards the New Year's and they're still a 500 team or a below 500 team, Sullivan could easily be out. And Rutherford, the GM, could be out. Pittsburgh is quick to make moves. They've already made a trade. They traded Carl Hagelin for Tanner Pearson. They're 0-2 since that trade happened, so clearly no, at least initial dividends in return for that trade. There could be other moves made. I don't think Sullivan's in danger of getting fired yet, but I think if this continues into December, then his seat could get very, very hot. And I think Rutherford's seat could get very hot. Rutherford just signed a contract extension, and I know that makes it seem like, okay, so he's going to be there longer. It's a weird thing with executives. You see this not only in hockey, but in other sports as well, especially football. As soon as a coach or a GM signs a contract extension, it seems like a few weeks later they're fired, they're gone. It happens all the time, and that could be what happens with Rutherford in Pittsburgh. He signs a contract extension, and a month later he's fired. And Sullivan could be fired too. I wouldn't be surprised if the Penguins canned both of them and just brought in new people, because this is not acceptable if you're the Pittsburgh Penguins. It just isn't. They're better than that, and they're not playing better than that to this point in the season, so changes have to be made. Todd McClellan. All right, this I definitely think is a long-term one, but Todd McClellan has been on the hot seat for most of last season with how bad the Oilers' season was. Now I really think he is on the hot seat for this year, but it's going to be based on whether or not the Oilers make the playoffs. And I really think it's going to be that simple. It's going to come down to, do the Oilers make the playoffs? If the Oilers make the playoffs, Todd McClellan stays coach, I think. If the Oilers miss the playoffs, I think it's a foregone conclusion that McClellan will be fired. So that's more of an end of the season decision more than a mid-season decision for Edmonton. I don't think McClellan is probably not going to get canned mid-season. However, if Edmonton falls off to the point where it becomes fairly obvious that they're not going to make the playoffs and it's mid-season, they will not hesitate to make that move. Or if they think that a coaching change can get them to the playoffs, maybe they're just rattling around 500, a few points out of a playoff spot, and things don't seem to be getting better, or they go on a losing streak, they could absolutely can McClellan, bring someone else, and try and get a boost that boosts them into the playoffs. So I think McClellan's got to watch out. This is a team that needs to win, and if they don't, he's going to be out of a job. More likely at the end of this season than during this season, but it could happen during this season. So those are the coaches that I really think are on the hot seat or headed towards the hot seat. And I definitely think that Mike Yeo and Dave Haxtell are the two closest to being fired next, but Quenneville was a surprise, so we've definitely seen surprises before in the NHL. It's definitely possible. But I do think that Haxtell and Yeo's seats are on fire right now. They have to start winning or they're going to be gone, maybe as early as next week. Bugner, Sullivan, and McClellan, I think, have a little bit longer leashes. But if the bad starts continue, then they're going to be out of a job as well, most likely. Another coach I couldn't fit on the board, but another one who might have to watch out for his job is Randy Carlyle in Anaheim. And that's not that anything going on in Anaheim is Carlyle's fault. It's more of just a shelf life kind of thing. He's been there for a while now. And I don't think Anaheim's going to make the playoffs this year. And I think that come the end of this year, they might just move on from Randy Carlyle and go in a different direction. I don't think any reason for Anaheim's drop-off. I think it's more age, roster, and lack of depth, quite frankly, is why they're dropping off. I don't think it's anything that Carlisle has much to do with, and it's not his fault. I just think he's been there for a while, and they're just going to want a new voice and to head into a new direction, especially if they have to start rebuilding, which they very well might. Anaheim could be headed for a rebuild. Carlisle's a win-now coach, not a guy that you rebuild with. So he could find himself out in Anaheim, but he would most likely get a job somewhere else pretty quickly because he's a very good NHL coach. So with that, that's what I've got on the current coaching situations, who I think's on the hot seat and who I think seats could get very hot. Like, comment, share, subscribe, follow on social media, check out offthewallhockey.com. All those links are down in the description below. If you'd like to further support Off the Wall Hockey, the link to our Patreon is in the description, as well as the link to our merch store. So if you'd like some Off the Wall Hockey merch, check that out. Keep spreading the word about this channel. Let's keep this thing growing. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll talk to you guys soon.